Welcome back, film fans, to the third in a series of videos where I'm looking at the works of Bruce Lee, and today we're on Way of the Dragon. I've kind of prefaced this video straight off by, in the title of it, asking the question, is this Lee's most entertaining film? And to me, the answer is a resounding yes. I believe it is. I think it's, throughout, Lee's most consistently entertaining film. And I believe that for two reasons. The first being, I think that they contain the most fully realised of what Lee wanted to put on screen, his philosophy of fighting and the best choreographed fight scenes that he put on film. I think that they're frequently interspersed throughout, so you get to see Lee in action a lot. And I think they, in terms of espousing his fight philosophy, particularly of Jeet Kune Do and fluidity and adaptability, and just seeing Lee's skills showcased, I think this is him at the peak of his powers, as it were. The second reason is I think this is Bruce Lee at his most charismatic. I think this is him at his most kind of like boyish and boisterous, and really functions well if you compare it, for example, to say Fist of Fury, where I said that Lee risks coming off excessively moody. Here he's the opposite. You know, he's kind of flamboyant and graceful, and it's almost the role that best showcases his youthful exuberance, right? And it made me think actually earlier of how it's almost impossible to imagine Lee being older, right? Because he died within a year of the release of this film. It's almost like Bruce Lee's trapped in time, right? We can't imagine him being older. He's always at this age. Okay. Another example would be, for example, in music, someone like Jimi Hendrix, right? Died at the age of 27. Okay. I'm now older than Jimi Hendrix ever was, but I always think of him as being older than me. And it's the exact same with Bruce Lee. It's hard to imagine these figures of youth, but of talent and exuberance and stature, somehow being older. I mean, Bruce Lee now would be in his 80s, for example, now. And it's, like I say, it's impossible to imagine almost. Almost like they were not designed to die early, but that their image was so intimately tied and connected to them being young. And like I say, I think it's encapsulated here the most, if that makes any sense. So Way of the Dragon, for those reasons, has always been my favourite Bruce Lee film ever since I first saw it. And when I first saw it, by the way, it wasn't the complete version. The nunchaku footage was completely censored, which is about 7 minutes. 7 minutes. It was completely omitted because the BBFC had a kind of draconian censorial policy that banned all footage and sight of nunchakus in films, and shuriken as well, incidentally. Which meant that I didn't see the extended fight scene where he kind of dual wields them against the Italian thugs until I was about 15, 16 years old. I was that big of a fan of this, actually, that when I went to college, the local college magazine, I wrote a few film articles in there where I was basically just reviewing films that I thought were great or were underappreciated and deserved to have more attention. And the film I chose as being representative of Lee's filmography was indeed Way of the Dragon. I wrote mostly about like kind of the fight scenes and the storytelling via the fight scenes that Lee was communicating in terms of narrative devices and so on and so forth. But that just shows you how big of a fan I've always been of this film. And I still would say it is my favourite Bruce Lee film, actually, from that perspective. That doesn't say it's necessarily his best. I do think it is flawed in some senses, and we can go into those flaws. But for me, I still think it's his most fully realised film. I think Game of Death was on its way to perhaps being the film that was the most fully realised, but in all intents and purposes, this is the Bruce Lee film because it's the first that he, of course, wrote and directed, so he had more of a complete creative control and vision, whereas Game of Death he didn't get to finish, of course, due to his untimely death, because he interrupted that film to make Enter the Dragon for Warner Brothers, of course. So I kind of want to make a case for this, a spirited kind of defence for this in a way, this film. based upon two main premises, really. But first, I think it's good if I read you a quote from a book. Now, I'm not going to tell you what this book is. I'll tell you what the title of the book is afterwards. It's a famous film book, so if you might guess it from what I'm saying if you're like a huge fan of films in general. But I'll start with the beginning of the entry on what is the entry for Bruce Lee. And it says, "In a way, it's hardly worth including Bruce Lee unless one can speak about him with passion. So because I can't find that warmth, I'll quote Kenneth Turan, who wrote," and then he gives us a quote from Kenneth Turan. That's the beginning of the passage of this entry on Bruce Lee. So how this writer can't muster the warmth and can't write about him with passion. He concludes his entry with this. "I happen to be writing this only a few days after September the 11th, 2001. I don't need to blame that on Lee, and I don't wish to be solemn. I will just say that, having failed to muster the interest to write this entry for months, I do now feel prompted." So that rather cruel, callous and dismissive overview of Bruce Lee as a figure in cinema comes from David Thompson's Biographical Dictionary of Film. David Thompson's like one of the most prominent, renowned and respected film writers and critics, by the way, and this book was voted by Sight and Sound International Film Magazine as being the best film book ever written. So that just goes to show you the kind of casualized dismissiveness and lack of respect that's given towards Bruce Lee as a figure in cinema in general. I think it's really symptomatic of that. So what does this tell us? Okay, because I think it's symptomatic of a particular cultural problem that there is with Bruce Lee when placing him in the context of cinema. Okay, because there's a tendency for Bruce Lee not to be taken that seriously, particularly by, like I say, the cognoscenti, the film writers, the critics, the theorists, academically speaking, so on and so forth. And that could be for a number of reasons. One is because of the kinds of films that Lee made, martial arts, low budget B-movie flicks, kind of have a history of not being taken that seriously by a number of people anyway. So it could be the in relation to the genre of the films that he made. Part of it, I suspect, is, I don't want to say it's latent racism, but there's probably a cultural bias against, again, the kinds of films that he's making and the kinds of film culture that he represents. Hong Kong entertainment, let's just call it. But I think there is a third, more insidious thing going on here, which is that I think there's a general suspicion towards Bruce Lee as a figure within cinema in general, which is that because they think that, I think they suspect Bruce Lee used cinema as a means to cultivate stardom to then launchpad his career and other ideas, I suppose. And not that he was interested in cinema proper, that he was a cineast or a serious filmmaker or in love with the arts of cinema or something. That's his crime, is that you kind of need to be in order to be taken seriously. And I want to challenge that very presupposition, actually, because I believe that Lee, in a way, does take cinema seriously. First off, you just have to look at the base changes that he introduced in terms of how he changed fighting choreography in cinema. He fought to make those changes possible. And you can see the progression through Big Boss, through to Way of Dragon, the elimination of, for example, weapon play, sword play, the unrealistic excessive jumps that you might see, for example, in Big Boss. They're not present here. It's all grounded. And you just look at the way Lee frames his action, right? He knows how to shoot. I wish more directors did this today, but he knows how to shoot a fight scene. Long takes, wide frame, the full figures in the frame, so you can see all of their body from head to toe, so you can see what the actors are doing. It's in-camera action. No excessive cutting, so it's not disorientating. You can actually tell what's going on. And I think that's key to why his fight with Chuck Norris, whose character's Colt in this, who plays like a kind of American martial arts kind of assassin for hire that's brought over to defeat the menace that's Tung Lung, Bruce Lee's character. That fight scene is so remarkable, still to this day. It's aged so well, I think, is because The skills are just there to see plain in sight in camera. And so Lee's demonstrated a kind of a dedication towards kind of owning his craft and what he wants to say, I think. But let's just look at Where the Dragging as being a test case of, because Lee had more creative control over this, it was a film that he not just starred in and did the choreography for, he also wrote and directed. It's the only completed film that he wrote and directed. Therefore, it's also his most authorial, it's his most personal film, okay? So what does actually the film communicate and what does it want to say? I think there's two key points for me of interest here. One is that I think it's a kind of autobiographical and reflective film on the nature of Bruce Lee as a person, his identity, his placement in the world, particularly his transnational identity, okay? And we can look at that in two ways in the film. First, we can look at, for example, how he's established as an outsider. Okay, how is he established as an outsider? Well, the opening scene in Where the Dragon, what do we see? We see him in the airport, only Asian man there, dressed in his martial arts gear, and a white old lady is staring at him. He's waiting for Nora Mao's character to pick him up from the airport. But meanwhile, this white lady is staring at him simply because of his difference to others. We get him scaring a young boy, dropping his ice cream and crying for his mummy, simply because he taps the boy and is trying to say that he's hungry and wants something to eat, because Lee can't speak English in this film. Lee's character, Tong Lung, can't speak English. And, you know, it's even framed, so it's framed from the boy's point of view, where it's looking up at Lee, making him look more intimidating and scary to the child, right? And then he goes into the restaurant, he wants to eat eggs, accidentally orders loads of soup. And even the woman there kind of treats him with a form of contempt, the waitress, which the woman there should be used to serving foreigners, right? She's working in a restaurant in the airport. So we know that that's somewhat unusual. So right from the outset, we know that there's a kind of a racist gaze that's being put upon Bruce Lee's character, Tong Lung, that he's kind of been victimized and oppressed from the outset by virtue of his difference. And then there's the cultural alienation he feels, right? He's come from Hong Kong, he's arrived in Rome, okay? And what we get is we see these different scenarios that Lee's put in. So he holds cash on him, he doesn't believe in putting it in a bank. He's nonetheless convinced to put it in a bank. The bank manager kind of, when opening an account with him, kind of in that kind of typical Italian cultural warmth, puts his arm around him and Lee tenses up. He's not used to that kind of cultural, physical closeness that Italians exhibit, for example. Another one is, for example, how he uses the toilet. It's different, and he's not used to the traffic there or the types of cars that they have there. There's all these sorts of different things that he's kind of negotiating and trying to understand that separates him from the Italian population that's there. Incidentally, there's also that interesting scene where he's being shown the sights by Nora Mao's character of Rome, such as like the Roman Forum and stuff, the ancient ruins. And he fails to see what the fuss is about. He says, why don't they just, you know, we have these in Hong Kong, why don't they just build apartments over them? So there's a base level of lack of cultural understanding and cultural awareness from both ends there, I think. But what makes it particularly interesting is it's not just his dislocation from home in regards to how Italian people treat him, but also his dislocation from his own people, right? The Chinese people that work at this restaurant that have settled in Rome. Nora Mao's character in one scene in the film asks him what it's like back in Hong Kong. And he kind of is somewhat dismissive and says, oh, I live in the new territories now. Okay, which is used to emphasize the fact that because they haven't been back to Hong Kong in a while, they wouldn't even know what the new territories is like. So there's this cultural difference between Lee's character Tong Lung and the other Chinese people in the film. There's also, for example, the film goes through great lengths to show how they've been westernized. So you have, they refer to themselves by their anglicized names, okay? Tony, for example. All the Chinese chefs and waiters there have that use their anglicised names. They all speak English. Tang Lun doesn't. They dress more in Western style. Tang Lun doesn't. And they also practice, incidentally, they practice karate, not Chinese boxing. And a thing is made of that where there is one character who one of the chefs and the waiters who kind of admires Lee straight away because Lee does Chinese boxing, and he berates the others for not sticking to their own martial art, as it were. So there's a lot about cultural identity in this, in which Lee he's set up as someone he can't seem to impress the Chinese people who he's been sent to protect, and of course he's not Italian. So there's this sense of utter dislocation and his inability to be one of anyone, really. And this goes back to Bruce Lee's nature as a person. What is Bruce Lee if not a transnational person, right? He was born in San Francisco, okay, grew up in Hong Kong, comes back to America to study in Seattle, drama and philosophy at the University of Washington, I think. And because of his frustration of not getting adequate film TV roles in America, goes back to make it in Hong Kong, and then makes Enter the Dragon, the American film, before he passes away. His parents, of course, one of them, his father's Chinese, his mother is not of pure Chinese heritage, and he holds dual nationality of American and Chinese. So Lee's almost asking himself, what does it mean for him to be a Chinese person, or an American person, or a Chinese American? What does it mean to be of somewhere and of everywhere and nowhere? And that's the nature of transnational identity, I think. So he's asking these questions of himself in a way. And it's important to note that he cannot impress the Chinese staff until he exhibits his martial arts. Right? That's the moment that he impresses them. That's the moment that Nora Mao's character begins to respect him and, let's be honest, is sexually attracted to him from that point on. And that fits in with a common theme across Lee's work in general, of where his supposed allies either mistrust or abandon him. So in Big Boss, it was his fellow co-workers and the people he lived with. They kind of turn on him when, after his promotion, they kind of think he sees himself as being better than them and not really aiding them in the investigation of the missing workers. In Fist of Fury, it's the fellow martial arts students who would rather see him in exile and disagree with his path of vengeance. And in Way of the Dragon, it's the fact that he just, because he can't speak English and doesn't know the cultural norms of Rome and of Italian society, that he's useless to them. He serves no use or purpose. And like I said, it's only until he exhibits his martial arts that they see use in him and that they're won over, right? And that's used as a dramatic device in this film, crucially, because the audience already knows this, right? If the Hong Kong audience at the time, they've probably already seen Big Boss and Fist of Fury, so they're predisposed to Lee's skills and utility as a martial artist. The characters in Way of the Dragon are not. So we have this dramatic device where we know something the characters don't, and when he's about to show them, Chef Wang comes out, calls them in and says there's customers, and so he delays that audience gratification of us getting them to see and find out firsthand how skilled he really is. So that's a good use there by Bruce Lee, to use that dramatic device of tension, I think, to withhold that audience gratification. Of course, we do finally see it when he takes on and beats up the Italian goons that come to accost the restaurant and the owners. But I think what's probably frustrating for a lot of people in this film is the first portion of the film, in which it feels like a bit of a travel log for us Western viewers, in which we kind of see the stereotypical sights of Rome. We see the Colosseum, the Roman Forum, the Trevi Fountains, which, filmically speaking, were made famous in Fellini's film La Dolce Vita in 1960. But for Hong Kong audiences, you must remember, and this film is primarily made for them, even though Bruce Lee is trying to expand into other markets at this point, they won't have seen these sites probably before, and nor will they have the means to ever see them back in the 70s. This is 50 years ago. And it is interesting to note how sparse and empty Rome looks back then. I've been to Rome about 6 or 7 years ago. I went off peak, and it was insanely busy. It was rammed. So to see it look quite empty, quite frankly, is again an interesting time capsule in and of itself. And actually, this is the last film to be shot in using interiors of the Colosseum. I think this is the last film to be allowed to do that. You can't film. You wouldn't be able to shoot a film in the Colosseum anymore. It's just literally not allowed. It's impossible. So I think Where the Dragon is Notable for being the last film to do that. The fight scene with Chuck Norris itself, of course, is using a set which they filmed back in the Golden Harvest Studios in Hong Kong, I believe. But a lot of the exteriors, which of course this film having a bigger budget than both Big Boss and Fist of Fury, based on the success of those two, was allowed to use more exterior shots and be shot in Rome in the first place. I think the second thing to note about this film is, I would say, aside from the exploration of transnational identity with Lee's character Tung Lung, is the fact that because of this he's a loner, right? And this fits in with an exploration of transnational identity in terms of how the film plays out in terms of a story. So what we get here is Lee's attempts to almost make a kind of spaghetti East Western, right? Or a spaghetti Eastern, for all intents and purposes, because you have a film that's made with Hong Kong money, okay, that's shot in Rome, just like spaghetti westerns were shot in Italy, and they were low budget B movies, just like Where the Dragon is, but it's using Western genre tropes. So you've got this curious mix here of kind of a cosmopolitan flavour of American, Italian, and East Asian flavours, if you like. We'll use that analogy. And what that actually does is it makes the film even more transnational in kind of scope. Okay, so let's just briefly look at the plot for a second. You have Tung Lung, who's sent from Hong Kong by his uncle to help a group of Chinese people that have opened this Chinese restaurant in Rome that's being extorted by local criminal corporate interests who want to basically essentially get rid of them, take over the land, remove the restaurant and basically buy up the land. And they refuse to sell because of this Chinese restaurant that they're running. So you have Lee as this kind of loner, enters into this strange town, helps the locals out being accosted by these local criminals, completes his task, and then leaves. And you get that great final shot of where Lee literally does. There's this long take of where Lee just walks off into the distance with his sack on his back as he goes to do his next quest. By very nature of him being a loner, he cannot stay. That's the kind of tragic dimension of this film. And there is an element of sadness to this film, I think, towards the film's close. There's a poignancy to that final shot. It's a great final shot and works wonderfully in contrast to the freeze frame of Fist of Fury. You have Bruce Lee coming into our screens with the fly kick in the end of Fist of Fury, the freeze frame, and here you have a long take where Bruce is walking away. And it's that noble heroic virtue of where he's completed his quest now, he's helped them, and he must move on to do something else. And it very much is that trope of the Western hero, the Western loner, who's condemned to kind of be alone. But Lee links that to his very dislocation, that he will always be alone because of he can't relate fully to Chinese diaspora, he can't relate fully to the West, and I suppose he only really belongs in the East with the character of Tung Lung, but nonetheless he's always elsewhere. He doesn't seem to be situated in Hong Kong, so he's helping other people. So again, that reflects upon Bruce Lee's own predicament as an actor and a movie star, as a human being. And the second main thing I want to talk about, I suppose, is the kind of the anti-orientalist stance that this film adopts. And this is where I think it functions in opposition to Enter the Dragon. I think Enter the Dragon, the very virtues there where the dragon has, Enter the Dragon, this is where the Enter the Dragon goes wrong for me. But I think that where the dragon is, it starts out placing Lee as a kind of a victim of racist attitudes and oppression. But by the film's close, we're seeing that so Bruce Lee's otherized, if you like, otherized is this idea of Edward Said's idea of Orientalism, in which the East is the invention of the West, and basically that we hold a lot of racist attitudes and stereotypes towards our conception of the East and people that come from there. We exoticize them, for example, by their differences and their foreignness. And Lee's held in contempt and racist gaze by the strangers and the locals at the beginning of the film. But what Lee does is, throughout the course of the film, by virtue of exhibiting his martial arts and showing his physical hyper-masculine prowess, that he becomes an emblem of hyper-masculinity and an idealization of that, is that by the close of the film, Chuck Norris's character of Colt is he's the white male body made other. He's the one who's marked by his difference. Because when you see that, when they face off before they're due to fight, they both derobe and they work out to warm up before they enter into combat with one another. And it's almost like Chuck Norris's body is as a subject for humour, and is almost vulgar in comparison to Lee's idealised, chiselled, hairless figure. And you have Chuck Norris's excessively hairy, not as chiselled figure in comparison to that's framed negatively. And even in the fight scene, Bruce Lee makes the gag of it, right? He grabs Chuck Norris's chest hair and rips it off to break from a clinch, if you like, when Bruce Lee's been downed on the floor, and kind of blows the hair off his hand when he gets back up. It's Chuck Norris's body that's made by virtue different. And so a reversal process occurs throughout the film, something which you don't get in Enter the Dragon. In fact, in Enter the Dragon, I think you get quite the opposite happening. So Where the Dragon is kind of radically anti-orientalist, which I think makes it a fascinating film. And he does it by exploring transnational identity, his own, through the character of Tang Lung, but also through showing himself as being, through his martial arts, being, which you've got to remember, right? What's Jeet Kune Do if not transnational martial arts? It's an amalgamation of all the best of what is useful of martial arts from around the world, whether that's fencing, karate, taekwondo, Chinese boxing, Western boxing, wrestling, all these different martial arts that are taken from different backgrounds. He then incorporates into Jeet Kune Do. A formlessness, okay? And you could argue that Bruce Lee as a figure is somewhat formless or baselessness. So those for me are the most kind of interesting aspects of the film, I think. And I just think that, I mean, another thing to mention as well is how much, aesthetically speaking, the film borrows from spaghetti westerns, right? Sergio Leone, who's the most famous director of spaghetti westerns from the 60s, who did the Man with No Name trilogy and Once Upon a Time in the West, a lot of his formal devices are employed here. I mean, you even have music somewhat repurposed and lifted from Once Upon a Time in the West for the theme when Chuck Norris's character Colt comes off the plane. But you also have the use of figures in geographical space. In long shot, you have the tense face-offs where they're brought together, intense close-ups, which is what Leone was a master of doing, of facial intense close-ups. And you also have these crash zooms that are used to essentially, as opposed to moving the camera, you keep the camera in the same place and it just quickly zooms onto the character who's far away. These are kind of things that were popular in the spaghetti westerns of the 60s, and they're used here. So that even more emphasises how much Lee is aware of the success of and popularity of spaghetti westerns, and employs the same formal techniques here to demonstrate an understanding of cinema. All this stuff can't. So Where the Dragon is surprisingly quite cine literate. And so my argument here is that I don't think Lee is someone who was simply disinterested in cinema and used it as a vehicle to launch his stardom, but that in fact he was actually someone who was working through his identity and also working through his martial arts through cinema itself, negotiating that through cinema. You see a progression from Big Boss through to at least Where the Dragon, those three efforts, I think. And that's what, to me, what makes it so fascinating and enduring is I just think it's his most successful effort. Of course, the fight scenes, I haven't even mentioned them yet, are outstanding. The again, the fact that Bruce knows how to shoot the full bodies in frame. It sounds like a common sense thing to do, right? But it I think it's just been done so well here. It's pretty amazing. I mean, the film's not perfect. I think the character of Ho, who's played by Paul Wei, who played the Chinese translator in Fist of Fury. I think both the characters that he plays in Fist of Fury and Way of the Dragon, but Way of the Dragon in particular, are very problematic in terms of their stereotyping of queerness. I think the sequence of the Italian Beauty is pretty well, it is misogynistic for all intents and purposes. But again, even that's couched in this kind of cultural misunderstanding in which one thinks they're flirting with the other, and then the other one thinks they're just being nice. The most interesting thing about that scene is when he goes back to what ostensibly I imagine is their apartment. He notices a mirror, and he starts practicing his martial arts in front of it, in a kind of scene of glorified narcissism almost. It's that's another telling aspect to Lee's personality, actually, I think. And we get more shots here than ever lingering on Bruce's physique, which I think, if anything, intensify his heroic, idealized nature in this. The fact he's almost superhuman, right? He's depicted as being this country bumpkin, out of his depth, which makes it even more amazing by virtue of contrast when he does what he does physically, right? And of course, what also makes him more heroic and virtuous is, for example, the respect he places at Colt's feet, really, when he's a fallen victim after he's been killed, and Bruce kind of respectfully kind of like mourns the fact that he's had to kill him. Again, a sensitivity that's present in Lee's work that is not often talked about. It's not just senseless killing. I think there's consequences there that Lee wants to show, right? Because again, I think we can say that's the only person that Bruce Lee's character Tong Lun kills in Way of the Dragon. And so it's even more dramatic for that reason. It's even more consequential. Yeah, I think that's pretty much covers a lot of what I want to say about Way of the Dragon. Like I say, I think it's the most interesting film to talk about of Lee's filmography, and it's, for me, I think certainly it's his most thoroughly entertaining. So let me know what you guys think, right? I think I'm probably in the minority in saying it's my favourite, but nonetheless, it'd be interesting to hear you guys what you think. Obviously, next in the series is Enter the Dragon. I won't review the release as such because it's not an Arrow Video release. They've just basically had the rights to Warner Brothers' 40th anniversary Blu-ray, so the extras are the same, and it's a Blu-ray, not a 4K upgrade. That's coming out, I think, in September from Warner Brothers. So I'll just talk about and discuss the film. I'll probably have some somewhat controversial opinions on that, as you could probably muster from what I've said about Way of the Dragon, where I think Way of the Dragon does things that Enter the Dragon doesn't do. Like I said, I don't think Way of the Dragon's a perfect film. A lot of it's out of focus at the beginning. That's another issue that I do have with Way of the Dragon, is you have both Bruce Lee in the background and a character in the foreground. They're both out of focus, and I can't believe no one noticed that when they were looking at the dailies. But again, there is I think Fist of Fury is still the best crafted, wholly Bruce Lee film. I'm just saying that this is, I think, the most interesting and still perhaps my favourite. I'm gonna hold off on that verdict definitively until I see Enter the Dragon, and of course the 78 version of Game of Death and all the Game of Death footage that there is, all 4 hours of it. But yeah, let me know your thoughts. I hope you can join me for the next one, the review of Enter the Dragon, which of course is the most famous and popular of all the Bruce Lee's films. And I will hopefully catch you on that one. Take it easy as always.